Today's story is another one of those about a freak accident. A bunch of very unlikely coincidences coming together and costing someone the ultimate price. But it's also a cautionary tale against waltzing up to random people's houses and asking if you can borrow one of their rooms to change your clothes. You never know what sort of crazy things happen behind closed doors. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history or culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. We are coming up on 2,000 subscribers, which I cannot begin to express how grateful I am. This is ultimately a labor of love for me, and I will do it regardless of how big or small the channel is. But the fact that we are still growing is still just wonderful in my eyes. Thank you so much. And here's to 2,000 subscribers in the near future, and again, thank you. But with all of that out of the way, once upon a time, ima wa mukashi. There was a well-known Buddhist priest in the capital who made his living wandering around offering rites and prayers in exchange for alms and offerings. Or at least, that's what this priest wanted you to think. I'm not sure if he actually was a priest, per se, as judging by the language of the text, it's at least somewhat likely that this man only played the part of a priest, but wasn't actually ordained officially to the priesthood, and probably didn't actually know any more about Buddhism than any random Johnny from off of the street. But he knew enough, and had seen priests doing their rites and their prayers enough to create a very convincing performance that he could then do to make people think he was a priest, and thus get himself some of those sweet, sweet priest offerings. Now, the next part of this story is actually another one of those that I'm not entirely sure what exactly it means, but the text says that this guy got the offerings of a nice place. Which, judging by what happens in the story, I think is best to think of it like he got the rights to a specific part of the city and offer his services there. It's almost like ancient Japanese priests were quasi-gang related and they'd have their territories, and in order to go do priestly work in a specific part of town, you had to actually get permission to do so. Again, I'm not entirely sure if that's exactly what happened, but that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting here. Now, if you read stories from around this time, like the Tale of the Heike, Buddhist priests and temples could actually be very possessive of their rights to administer to highborn people, and guarded these rights very, very jealously. It's been a while since I read the Tale of the Heike, but I do believe that one of the major temples near the capital would send literal armies to the city if they felt like they had gotten cheated out of saying prayers and whatnot on behalf of the emperor. Feel free to fill me in with the details of all of that stuff in the comments if you remember it better than I do. The point is, though, that my guess is that this guy couldn't just wander up to random houses and ask if they wanted a priest to pray for them or do other Buddhist rites. No. He had to get permission first, and get permission he did. Again, to a very nice part of town that was known for rewarding priests very generously, for which he was indeed very glad. There was just one problem, though. This place was actually a fairly long distance away from where he currently lived, and he didn't have a carriage. Now, this priest did his best to try to get somebody to lend him one, but for whatever reason, no one was capable or willing to do so. This meant he was going to have to go on foot. Now, this wasn't really a problem in and of itself. It's not like this guy thought of himself above walking. A good priest was, after all, supposed to renounce worldly luxuries, but over the course of walking that far, he was bound to get hot, sweaty, and probably dirty. And that just wasn't becoming for anyone at all, let alone a guy who was trying to pose as a high-class priest. You have to remember that it was very common at the time for members of the aristocracy who, for whatever reason, couldn't move up in society and court rank, often turned to religion instead, using that as an avenue for wealth, prestige, and power. As such, even though Buddhist priests were expected to remove themselves from society, there was a very large population of people who were raised in high-class society and had no intention of living below their station, but also ended up joining the Buddhist priesthood. And so, classy people often called on classy priests since there were cultural and sometimes familial connections there. So imagine if everyone in this fancy neighborhood saw this priest of our story just wandering along the road like an ordinary peasant, sweaty and dusty and just generally gross and unkempt, disheveled. Ugh. They'd start questioning if he really was worth the money, and his entire scheme would go up in flames. So, faced with the problem of no carriage, the priest hit on an idea instead. He would first put on regular travel clothes and one of those conical hats. Gotta keep the sun off of that shaven head of his to make people believe that he spends all of his time indoors like a fancy priest. And then find someone living just outside of the place he was going to solicit, get them to lend him one of their rooms, change into his priest's garb, and then enjoy the fruits of doing the Buddha's work in a place with lots of money without a disheveled appearance. It wasn't a complicated plan, but hey, simple plans are the easiest to follow through on. And so this fake priest then finished his preparations and headed out. The journey was, as he had expected, long and somewhat arduous. When he got close to his destination, he did just as planned. He looked around for a small, inconspicuous house nearby, definitely not the abode of a high-ranking lord or lady, approached and announced his arrival. He was answered by a young woman. Judging by the way she carried herself, answering the door yourself as a woman was something that typically didn't happen in the city. She appeared to be the owner, or at least the wife of the owner. The priest then explained his situation, or rather said whatever he thought would get this woman to let him use her house to change in. But whatever he told her, it was effective. After all, he was an expert in putting on airs, and the woman was more than happy to lend her home to the benefit of a man of the cloth, and had him admitted straight in. She then led him to what looked like a guest room, laid out a mat for him to use on the floor, and then left him to do his thing, which he wasted no time in doing as soon as she left the room. Now, what this non-priest didn't know is that the lady of this house was actually very familiar with Buddhist priests, or rather one Buddhist priest in particular, who made a habit of coming around and administering to this woman. If you're noticing a pattern of priests not being super faithful to their vows between this and the previous story, well, if these stories are anything to go by, that wasn't that surprising. Now, the lady of the house wasn't interested in having more than one Buddha boy teach her all about the sutra that is most famous in the West, despite not being part of the regular Buddhist canon, if you know what I mean. But she had been sweet on the one priest long enough that this woman's husband, the man to whom she was actually married to, started getting suspicious. The husband was a low-ranking zoshiki, a job not much better than a peasant who did odd jobs for mid-ranking aristocrats. You might even consider them the servants of the servants, but we won't get into the details because frankly, I don't know them that well and Heian society is rather complicated. But no matter his rank, this guy had his suspicions that his wife was fooling around with a priest, and decided that he was going to see if he could catch this wife's priest lover in the act of not honoring his priest's vows to abstain from intimate relations with women, and in particular, his wife. And it just so happened that very day, this man, making sure that his wife was watching, told her he was going to go out for work, as usual, and wouldn't be back for a while. He then left. But as soon as he was out of sight of his house, he doubled back just a bit, went up to one of his neighbors' houses, knocked on the door, and asked if he could borrow one of their rooms for a while. One that just so happened to have a visual of the entrance to his own residence. And then he waited. I don't know what he said to convince the neighbor to let him hang out there. Maybe it was kind of an open secret that the rest of the neighborhood knew, but nobody had told this guy out of a dual sense of it's none of my business and not wanting to be the bearer of bad news, because, as you will see, this guy wasn't exactly someone you wanted to upset. And so, after a relatively short time of waiting in his neighbor's house, wouldn't you know it, a Buddhist priest showed up. This man then watched from his neighbor's window as this priest knocked on the door, was greeted by his wife, and then let inside. Now, of course, this husband had no idea that the guy who was currently availing himself of his own house wasn't the priest his wife was fooling around with. He just knew that it was a priest he was after, and his wife had just let what appeared to be a priest inside almost immediately after he had left. What probably didn't help matters was that this guy had clearly come in clothes designed to be inconspicuous, but it was clear by his shaved head and staff that he was, in fact, a Buddhist priest. With no further questions and wasting no more time, this man stormed off back to his house, ripped the door open, made his way from room to room, slamming each door open, one after the other, until he found a priest, halfway undressed, and fairly good looking to be fair, in the guest room. The man then whipped around to his wife, who happened to be kind of nearby, and yelled at her, "You lied to me, you worthless woman." Again, it's not a very nice guy. The wife, who was only slightly less hot-headed than her husband, indignantly shouted back, "I didn't lie. I have no idea who this guy is. He said he wanted to work in the next area over and only asked for a place to change into his priest garb, which I gave him. Stop freaking out." This man, though, was having none of it. He had made up his mind, and in his fury he was beyond reason. And without saying a single other word, he drew his sword, ran over to this fake priest, still not fully dressed, mind you, and just kind of standing there completely dumbstruck with zero idea of what to do about this, grabbed him, and then ran his blade through the middle of this priest's torso. The priest raised his hands in disbelief, not fully comprehending what was happening to him, and not really knowing how to respond to getting stabbed with a sword. But when the man pulled his blade out from the priest's chest, the priest then fell backwards and hit the ground with a hard thud. The wife now screamed at her husband, "What's the matter with you?" along with a whole litany of panicked accusations and insults, which, fair enough, honestly. The man, then, not wasting a single second, immediately darted out of the house and just started sprinting away as fast as he could. On some level, he knew that what he did was a big no-no. And maybe the shock of murdering somebody was enough to dispel his rage, but after realizing what he had done, and in a panic, he just ran. However, one of the priest's page boys, because the guy had page boys with him, shouted as the man tore down the street, "That man just murdered my master!" Whereupon a group of neighborhood men, quick on the uptake, happened to be right in this man's escape path, and noting the screaming wife and the page boy pointing and yelling accusations, they then tackled the murderer and kept him from escaping. The priest, meanwhile, didn't die immediately. Instead, he laid there on the floor of this random house for a while as he watched all of this happening, and wondered to himself how in the world all of this could have come about. But his wound was severe enough, and Japanese medical capabilities weren't advanced enough to really do anything for him. And after what was probably a very painful and terribly long while, he eventually succumbed to his wound and passed away. Eventually the keibiishi, aka the old-time Japanese police, showed up, and the people of the house and the neighborhood turned the murderer over to them. Though I guess as part of the investigation, they also turned the wife over to the keibiishi as well. Though after everything was said and done, only the man was put in prison, which I didn't know they actually had prisons at that time, but turns out they did. And then of course the text has to get a little bit moralistic for us, and says that 3 people suffered because of a rather silly happenstance, and that was really, really unfortunate. And of course we have to wonder at what sort of karma from past lives led these 3 to end up in this very bizarre, very tragic situation. And then we have some moral advice for the readers. And thus is it said that no one, high or low, even if it's just for a little bit, should go around asking to stay in random people's houses. You never know what goes on behind the walls of other people's homes, or when some kind of freak coincidence will happen if you should do so. And that is the end of the story. Now again, this is not a particularly happy story, but it is ancient folklore, so I mean, if you've ever read the original Brothers Grimm's tales, you probably understand this. And it is certainly one of the things that probably would have made it into the newspapers if they had had newspapers back in the day. And it also just goes to show that you engage with random people at your own peril. They might just think that you are cheating with their significant other, and then, well, you know, do that. I don't actually have much in the way of cultural commentary, so I'm just going to actually end it here. So if you did enjoy this story, please don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel, because again, we are coming up on 2,000, which is amazing, wonderful. Thank you so very much for that. And if you really want to help, please don't forget to share this with friends, family, people who like Japanese culture, Japanese history, people who like storytelling in general, and just you know, somebody who needs something to put on in the background while they fold laundry or wash the dishes or do whatever other menial house chores. Or maybe you're stuck in traffic. That's one thing that was one place where I would often listen to long form YouTube stuff when I was living back in the States. But whatever, just anybody that you think would be interested in this kind of a thing. And so, if you've been watching all the way up to the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito ureshu koso haberi kere. And hopefully we will see you next week for the next story, which is also another story about people getting offed for really, really stupid reasons. Although this one is a little bit more relatable to me because I do like to play video games, and sometimes I have to admit, I can be a little bit ragey. Okay, it's not bad, like I don't punch things or anything, but sometimes admittedly, I can get a little upset at the games when I'm not winning. But this story involves somebody raging at a game and taking it to the extreme. You'll just have to wait and see for that one. Anyways, thank you so much once more, guys. Have a good one. Goodbye.